People who grew up in the 1990s may remember other discontinued foods from the era, and of course those of a certain age will remember candy cigarettes. Not because of the chalky and sugary taste, but maybe because they're so daring, so nervy, so delightfully wrong. Made out of a chalky sugar, bubblegum, or chocolate, wrapped in paper, and packaged and branded to resemble cigarettes. But the biggest controversy is that tobacco companies and candy manufacturers have cooperated to make candy cigarettes to train kids to become smokers later in life. Allowing candy cigarette companies to use their branding, Brown and Williamson has gone as far as to send copies of its label to candy cigarette companies. Some products contain powdered sugar hidden in the wrapper, allowing the user to blow into the cigarette and produce a cloud of sugar that imitates smoke, which comes out on the other end. But there was a time when it was perfectly normal to see a kid puffing on a candy cigarette. Americans have been enjoying candy cigarettes since the late 1880s, when they started as chocolate smokes. They were sold to kids and adults, right alongside the real thing. But candy cigarettes rose to fame in the American market in the 1920s. The Hershey Corporation had just started making it big in the chocolate industry with their massive chocolate production. As part of their growth strategy, they sought out new ways to mold their candy into household objects that people found familiar. They had chocolate tricycles with other kid toys that appealed to households, and not long after, candy cigarettes. Not surprisingly, this sugary stick made the most sales. Tobacco had been a staple in many households for centuries, and at the time, there was a surge in candy sales. While this was going on, cigarette companies didn't endorse the use of their brand to create candy cigarettes. However, candy manufacturers still ran with it. They used the close to perfect resemblance of these candies to promote their goodies either way. Their goal was to feed on the curiosity of kids and their desire to emulate their parents. The marketing was so brilliant that cigarette companies gradually began to buy into the idea. They saw the potential of young kids becoming their consumers when they grew older, old enough to smoke the real deal. They looked so identical that you could buy a pack for a quick smoke and end up with candy instead. Over the years, different companies tried to dethrone Hershey, and other competitors rose in the candy cigarette market, so to speak. The packaging got more real, the candy got sweeter, and more flavors rolled out. One brand that stood out in all of this marketing brouhaha was Just Like Daddy. The box design was friendly and their slogan was catchy. Reach for a pack, just like Daddy. This made them the top seller of cigarette candies between the 1930s and the 40s. But reach for a pack, just like Daddy? Come on now.
I'm just like you, Dad. Candy cigarettes.
You rot your teeth. Here.
The marketing, the product design, and the additional sugary powder of candy cigarettes all meant one thing. These companies were hell-bent on getting kids into smoking. The tobacco industry has called children their replacement smokers. All the signs that candy cigarettes weren't harmless sweets or toys were glaring enough. But the pro-candy cigarette arguments began to surface. Some people believed that candy cigarettes wouldn't influence children to smoke just as much as toy guns wouldn't influence them to be shooters or counterfeit money wouldn't influence them to be scammers. However, studies indeed showed that candy cigarettes created a sense of normalcy in kids' views on smoking. There were adults smoking around them all the time. The problem went beyond eating candy to the very act of buying candy. This power of purchase could lead children to feelings of independence and self-assuredness, and that could get them to behave that they were adults and start acting like adults, which would inevitably lead to drinking, gambling, and yes, smoking. A catchy slogan encouraging them to grab a pack, and they were so cheap and accessible at stores that kids could get them whenever they had very little cash to spend. All these desensitized them from the dangers of smoking. During this time, some cigarette companies were not having it with copyright infringement. These cigarette companies began to push back and fight for their authenticity. The first company to make an issue with this unapproved package imitation was Lucky Strike. Lucky Strike started a campaign that sought to brand Lucky Smoke's candy cigarettes as unhealthy. They created a slogan, "Reach for a Lucky instead of a sweet," to encourage women to maintain a girlish figure by smoking instead of eating candy. Their little anti-candy cigarette drove market shares up by over 200%, and it became the best-selling brand until the 1950s. Weight was a big deal then, so it does make sense that women would want to smoke to maintain their figure and not take candy that could gain them a few pounds. In response to this anti-candy cigarette campaign, the candy cigarette industry began counter-marketing cigarettes. Every ad they make was crafted to paint cigarettes as a product that poison the body with nicotine. The battle line was officially drawn after this jab, and after a while, the FTC stepped in to mediate the squabble. Candy cigarettes were later ruled out as indirect advertisements directed towards children. Eventually, some cigarette manufacturers took the candy cigarette makers to court. The result? Well, all candy cigarettes had to be off-branded. While this may sound like a big deal to us now, it didn't feel like it back then. As a matter of fact, people were quite confused about this quote-unquote beef between the two industries that were obviously benefiting from each other. Well, that was because cigarettes weren't known to be detrimental to health at the time. People used to think that cigarettes were healthy, made to clean your lungs, or just a prop that makes you look cooler. Until the 1950s, when it became public knowledge that cigarettes were in fact poisonous. Reports got out that cigarettes were bad for the health, and parents started getting worried about candy cigarettes too. In 1953, candy cigarettes were banned in North Dakota, and this ban lasted only for 14 years until it was overturned in 1967. The US government also had plans to ban candy cigarettes twice, once in 1970 and another time in 1991. But for some reason, they never passed through voting, making North Dakota the only state to ban candy cigarettes. However, in the same year, to avoid any trouble, the candy cigarette industry dropped the cigarette branding and changed it to sticks. As part of their rebranding, they were then called candy sticks. Rebranding as cigarettes already lost its appeal, and they knew they had to find a way to stay in business. So that was the best that they could come up with at the time. But this survival tactic wasn't really going to keep them out of the spotlight. The world now knows the dangers of tobacco to kids. So whenever a kid is caught using cigarettes as props or showing smoking behavior, it is immediately linked to candy cigarettes. It begins to make its rounds on the news once again. And this isn't to say that the tobacco industry didn't receive a share of the backlash either. After a report by the Surgeon General got out in 1964, cigarettes began to lose their cool among grown-ups too. Another event that pushed candy cigarettes into oblivion was the ban on television advertisements that promoted tobacco intake in the 1970s.
The Philip Morris Company has bought all commercial time on the first half hour of all the network talk shows tonight. That is the last half hour on which it is legal to sell cigarettes on radio or television in the United States.
As the publicity for smoking cigarettes reduced, so did the demand for candy cigarettes. Tobacco companies could no longer reach their target audience like they used to. As they were now restricted from advertising during TV commercial breaks, tobacco companies resorted to billboard advertising at televised events. Not long after, the government caught on with its sneaky advertisement tactic and rolled out with more restrictions on tobacco advertisements. Tobacco advertisements were then banned from cartoons and other sponsorships that could easily get to kids. Joe Camel has long been retired, and the Marlboro Man has been put out to pasture. Cigarette commercials are relics of the past, and you're about as likely to see smoking in a kid's movie as you are to see a loving step-parent. And yet, one product deemed so harmful that nearly dozens of countries have banned it remains available: candy cigarettes. Although there weren't any direct restrictions on candy cigarettes, the tobacco ban reduced the appearance of cigarettes altogether. While candy cigarettes may be difficult to find today, they are still a thing, and they still cause the damage that they were designed for, just on a smaller scale. The only people suspected to still be purchasing them are the grown-ups who want to have a little nostalgic moment with their favorite childhood candy. I mean, it is good to reminisce every now and then. Therese McDonald, founder of the Chicago-based specialty candy store Candynality, also revealed that parents and grandparents come into their store to rediscover candy cigarettes. Candy cigarette sellers believe that these products won't be around forever, so they knew they had to find a way to have the new generation hooked. Now we have vapes, another one of the tobacco industry's tactics to gain new customers. Candy cigarettes have now re-emerged as vapes. These e-cigarettes have been marketed to sell to kids that have been designed to rejuvenate the appeal of smoking. But unlike candy cigarettes, vapes do more than just teach kids how to smoke or increase their interest in smoking. They can actually cause harm to children. These electronic cigarettes expose users to harmful toxins that could lead to lung cancer. This just goes to show how far the tobacco industry would go to remain in business. The good news is that several studies have shown that vapes are indeed bad for our health, and unlike in the 80s, more people have access to the internet, so news got out pretty fast. The government isn't letting this targeting on kids slide this time around either. A full ban is expected to be in full force soon. Would you look at that? History truly does repeat itself. Anyways, that would be all for now. Hit the like button and let me know in the comments below. Do you think that candy cigarettes, like toys and candies, could cause kids to be smokers? Or do you think that there's no link between the two? Let me know.